I've had the opportunity not only to be exposed to the dark side and to evil, but to great people, great men, great heroes. People like Simon Wiesenthal, people like Pope John Paul II. You walk into the room, you can tell in a nanosecond that you're in the presence of somebody very special. And there are many other people, famous and sometimes anonymous, in which I can more or less tell. In the case of Ed Ramsey, first time you meet him, uh, it's just a tremendous presence, self-assured. If you ask him a question, you're going to get an informed answer. And eventually, when I first came to read the book, and of course knowing Raquel initially as a colleague at our affiliated high school here, she was trying to teach rambunctious young Jewish teenagers, how to write a proper sentence. That's also a courageous undertaking.
Well, tell me about the first time, like the very first time you met Ed. Do you remember that experience?
I met Ed once here in the old campus here on Pico Boulevard when Raquel had, I guess he was picking her up. It was just one of those instances, and I'd already begun to hear about this incredible story about the one guy who didn't surrender, went up into the mountains, and then the rest of the story. Actually, everything about him before I met him seemed larger than life, but from the time that I met him, and we didn't have that many long conversations, but because I travel to Asia a great deal, when I would ask him some questions, he informed me in ways that were really very helpful. It gave a little bit more of a focus. But maybe the most important thing to say from where I sit in my interaction, and why I think he continued to be a hero, and why his story should be told, is I never detected any hate in this man. It's not so simple, having grown up in the 50s, 60s with the war movies, about World War II and the quote unquote the Japs and the horrible things, unfortunately many of them true, during Imperial Japan. But here was a person who, if ever, would have had a blank check to hate the enemy and to hate what they did. I saw in there someone who didn't have any hate in him, totally grounded, eyes wide open. And when I asked them specific questions, we'd be very involved, often with controversial issues involving Japan. His advice was always spot on. And I'm not comparing him in any way, shape, or form to a Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal, first and foremost, was a victim. He was a civilian, a victim, had no way to fight back, almost died in incarceration, lost 89 members of his family. And yet, one of Mr. Wiesenthal's enduring legacies is the man didn't hate. So if someone who went through all of that came out with a worldview and an approach to life that was free of hatred, it wasn't based on forgetfulness at all. He was involved in bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. Accountability, yes, but not hatred. I think one of the reasons that I was so attracted to this figure is I never detected any hate in him, and I think that's one of the reasons why I think that his old foes, the Japanese, respected him as well.
You kind of alluded to this, but what was your very first impression when you met him for the first time? And had you already had some background information?
I had some background information. Raquel Ramsey is a pretty accomplished person in her own right. She went on to be the head of the English department in Beverly Hills, but she's also a striking individual. But she told me a little bit about Ed, knowing that I was occasionally going off to Asia. And then when I started reading and learning about him, I couldn't believe it, because the storyline read like a movie. And then to meet him, obviously, he wasn't a kid anymore, but I met him over 30 years ago. The thing about that most impressed me when I saw him is the man had a presence. He commanded respect before he ever opened his mouth, and he did. There was nothing fearsome about him, But there was something about this man when I looked at him and said, in the back of my mind, if I was ever in a fight, I think I'd like to have him have my back.
What impressed you about him the most?
I think the way he carried himself before he even opened his mouth. It was just a bearing when he walked in. I'm not going to use the word, this was not someone who I think was interested in controlling. Quite the contrary. Just someone who had an aura about him that he can handle the situation. And as I said, always I found him to be focused, friendly, and if you asked him a question, you usually got a good answer.
Had you read his? I think you alluded to this as well. Have you read his book?
I read his book very early. I don't usually read books more than once, but I read that book a few times, and I urged a lot of people that I knew to do the same, because from beginning to end, he's a real hero, the man who led the last cavalry charge in the history of the United States. Such an incredible patriot, but someone who didn't wear it on his shoulder. And just reading these vignettes, I do a lot of flying. That's where I get most of my culture these days. So watch movies, you can skip back and forth now, you get 100 movies to choose from. It was the kind of book that you'd go back and read a particular incident or series of things. And, unlike most books, where what you read is what you get, and maybe there was less there than met the eye, the more you became familiar with this man's story, the more you kept asking, how the heck did this person survive? How did he do it? And then, of course, while I didn't go into much detail about his post-World War II activities, it was clear that a lot of people in Asia had a lot of respect for him, and a lot of people in the States who, in positions of responsibility, who had, American policy they wanted to pursue, that, this is not someone you put back on a shelf somewhere, but one way or the other, it's someone that you want to keep close to you if you need some real perspective.
Within a few years of the end of World War II, Ed was doing a lot of business in Japan. Did he ever talk about his feelings about working with the Japanese and how he was able to do that with no malice?
Well, I didn't speak to the issue about doing business, but actually he was the first person that I had met who had been in an adversarial situation, let's just put it that way, with Imperial Japan, who had seemingly seamlessly stepped to the next phase of his life, and Japan was now a democracy. We won, they lost, and it was time to get on, as long as somebody was ready to respect. I have since met former American POWs, some of the people who couldn't make it into the mountains and jungles, and everything that they suffered, forced marches in Bataan, and those slave ships back to Japan, many of them bombed, and working in the mines, and all of the other horrors. There were no good choices back then, but amazingly, many of the people that I met also were able to step beyond, and many of them made their way back to Japan or even hosted Japanese students. So since it was a part of the world that I was blissfully ignorant about, completely, and I suddenly found myself in my position, having to go over to that part of the world, I just found that his approach, his attitudes towards the people of Japan, but also his understanding of how things work there. I'll make it clear, I've been to Japan now about 35 times. I don't understand them at all. By the way, they don't get me either, so we're a perfect match. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. But sometimes it's really more important about what you don't do and how you carry yourself, and the basic approach. And he's one of the people who informed me about developing, an attitude. And in Asia, body language is everything. And like I said, the first thing about this man that I remembered is when he walked into a room, he commanded respect.
How do you think Ed inspired such a loyalty from the Filipinos, many who were tortured and killed in some instances, and yet they never betrayed him?
Well, this is something that I saw here many times at the Wiesenthal Center at the Museum of Tolerance over the years, when we had like a 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. We even had something for the veterans who are still around. And on occasion, we've had the Philippine Scouts and others come through, and the magic word, just say, if you said Ramsey, everybody knew the story. They, I've gotten to know many Filipino people over the world. I visited there when I spent a few days after last year's horrific monsoon. They're a very special people. Amazing. I mean, the suffering that was that they endured, and their loyalty to not only to Ed, but sort of to the ideal of an America after everything they endured, is quite remarkable. I think it's a mystery, but it's really something that I think the American people have not fully understood or acknowledged. I think in the case of a true leader in our tradition, the Jewish tradition, and I think also, without getting too melodramatic about it, in the Israeli tradition of the military, there are only two ways to lead when you're an officer: from the rear with maps or from the front. And Israeli casualties are always highest among officers because they lead from the front. Ed Ramsey was a natural leader. I think everyone up there, everyone who was involved in trying to defeat the Japanese occupation, saw this man as someone who didn't have to be there. And I think he emerged as not only someone who needed to be hidden, but someone who's a natural leader and was proactive. It's different than hiding in a bunker for 2 years until the general returns. So he wasn't only hunted, he was involved in hitting the enemy. Just a remarkable person. But I think there is something unique about the Filipino people. They're both gentle and full of steel at the same time. And when they saw someone who was loyal, ready to put his life on the line, and I think when he saw what they were prepared to do to keep him alive, it's a remarkable bond. So in a lot of ways, I think the people in the Philippines understand Ed Ramsey's legacy maybe a lot more than Americans do.
Let's talk about the relationship between Ed and Rocky. I mean, just that facial expression you just gave says a lot. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, let's start backwards. That relationship continues. She's the guardian of his legacy, and you can, even through an email, through a photo, you can still see the bond of between the two of them now, even though that he's gone. It's not a morbid thing. She was at the funeral. She knows he's not there, but what it is that he stood for, and the story, his story that will continue to inspire people for a very long time on both sides of the Pacific. So that is both a reflection of the man, but it's also a reflection of the woman and their relationship. I don't have the guts to ask Raquel Ramsey how old she is. Chronologically, it doesn't make a difference anyway. She's one of the youngest spirits that I've seen, but oh my God, these two people who were, when they walked into the room together, were just completely enamored with each other. You got the feeling that they would go from your office, do some ballroom dancing. It was just, that intense. But I think it wasn't, just a matter of the two individuals in love. I think that she was also someone who completely embraced the fact that this man was a great hero in the Philippines as well. She never let that get in the way of their personal relationship, but I think that's something that she really internalized and became a part of. Go to the apartment today, it's a museum. And there are a lot of people, when they lose a spouse, they'll talk about them. You walk out maybe feeling sorry for them, teary-eyed. You go see Raquel, spend a half hour going through the old photos and the medals, etc. You walk out with a lift in your step. So that's quite remarkable. It's a very, very unique relationship, and I probably just say I think they deserved each other.
What effect did Ed have on those who knew, yourself included?
Well, for me, um, it was someone who was part of living history. This is, after all, the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Museum of Tolerance. We are about history. It's interesting that we're headquartered here in Los Angeles, next door to Hollywood, where they have to make up heroes, comic book heroes, all sorts of heroes. Captain America, one of my favorites, jumping around, killing. Well, here's a real hero, capital H, a real person, certainly no saint, just a great American who's, he is the personification of what patriotism is. And as I said, that's, I think, the most important thing that I learned about Asia is that if you walk into a meeting with a chip on your shoulder anywhere in Asia, they can see how big it is before you ever open your mouth. This is a man who was loyal to his country. He defended himself. He took lives. He knew why he was doing it. Not a hater. What a great hero. And I think that's the other piece of it is that, Judaism doesn't believe in saints. We don't have any. We'd like to think, especially, people will try to act in a saintly fashion, in a decent fashion. But one of the great things about people like Ed Ramsey, Sugihara, who, by the way, during World War II was saving a couple of thousand Jews against orders over in Europe as a diplomat. These were people who knew what they were doing, why they were doing it, and were prepared to pay the consequences. And I'm sure this is a man, he did come out alive, who didn't have a death wish at all, but he was prepared to die for his flag, for his nation, and for his friends in the Philippines. Every moment he was in those jungles, and yet the minute it was over, he brushed himself off, got on with the rest of his life, and those are the kinds of real heroes. If you're looking for a saint, please, I can give you the email for the Vatican City, and you can look at people who did great and saintly things. I think what young people really need today are role models of people who are real, flawed, ultimately persevere, and someone like Ed Ramsey left such an amazing legacy, not just from the time in the jungle, but that's really where, if you might say, he honed his life skills.
Phenomenal.
When we talked the other day, you had mentioned about the guy who put the price on his head, who bowed out of respect to
Right.
Ed when he was in Japan.
Right,
Can you
right.
retell that a little bit?
Yeah,
Talk about
I'm going to, thank you for bringing it up. So 5 weeks ago, here on a Sunday, we had an amazing, amazing event in which Mitsubishi brought over a team of people from Tokyo and bowed in front of 50 cameras before a 94-year-old ex-POW named James Murphy and the spouses and children of other former POWs who since passed. It was quite remarkable to watch a Japanese official. Next to him was a man representing Abe there. He was almost at 90 degrees in his bow. Now, I know enough about the Japanese and about Asia. And by the way, it's also true about Koreans and other groups. They hate to apologize. Hate. They would rather do almost anything else. Culturally, it's really, really, really difficult to do. And so that moment became a huge story all over Asia for obvious reasons, because an important entity in Japan actually publicly apologized. Now, and we were asked by both sides to be the venue, which, at the Museum of Tolerance, which is quite important. I was thinking about Ed a lot in the run-up to that meeting and how I would handle it. And one of the things in the back of my mind was, and it's maybe the one time I wish I could have been there, when the person was put in charge of beheading him and giving the 100,000 cash to whoever was going to turn him in. When they had the reunion and he actually bowed to Ed Ramsey. That's sort of the other side. It's one of the reminders also that culturally we actually have a lot to learn from each other. Because at the end of the day, when you have those moments, and they're few and far between, those are important teaching moments as well. And I just always keep in my mind, that moment. And I'm sure that when it took place, I'm sure there was a sense of satisfaction of someone who had beaten the odds, not only lived long enough to see Japan being defeated, but was part of the reason why they lost. For him to have that moment and then to move on for a basis upon which you can build out relationships. That's a very, very powerful teaching moment. I know, because these kinds of moments are very few and far between.